Welcome. In this demonstration, we will see how to draw a kind of big stone, or almost you can consider it a kind of rock. So essentially, in an earlier demonstration, we saw how to draw this kind of, stones receding, these kind of stones, a pile of stone. So essentially, we learned how to draw this, and what we will see is that drawing a rock is in a way similar to drawing these kind of stones that are on top of each other. So essentially, what we do, we start by essentially laying down again, the kind of the stones in the front that we saw earlier, and what we do essentially is to then again define these kind of stones that are kind of laying out above it, right? So this is the same technique that we use to kind of create the stones that are on top of each other. But the difference is that this time we are not touching it all the way to the edge. So essentially, when you see this other line, I'm leaving it some of the distance over here, so I'm not touching it all the way to this line over here. So essentially what we are doing now is to essentially create this kind of different layers of kind of ridges on the surface of our rock. So essentially what we want or what we will draw in this demonstration is a kind of rock that has these kind of different ridges on its surface. And the way you create these ridges is similar to how you draw these different layers of these different stones on top of each other. So the technique is the same. So essentially that's what I just did over here. So what I did was to essentially create a kind of and then what I can do again draw one over here. So essentially the way you create a kind of rock with these ridges is similar to how you draw these layers of these stones on top of each other. So essentially you start by drawing the one at the base, and then you just simply add other lines, something like this. What happens is that these lines they kind of create a kind of ridge that you have in your stone, and that's what I did over here. And the one difference is that because we do not want to make it appear as if these are like stones on top of one another, what you do is you leave this space, a little bit of this white space over here. And this white space essentially serves to kind of create a kind of ridge versus stones lying on top of one another. So this is how you can give it a feel of a rock, for example, having these kind of different layers. And what we do next is to essentially texture it the same way that we textured the stones earlier, which is to use again these parallel lines. So again I use these parallel lines to essentially create one level or one layer of tone, and then I'll go back and essentially add a different layer of second layer by adding more parallel lines. So let's start by laying down one layer of lines, and then we'll go back and add one more layer. So as you can see, what we have done is to use the same technique that we use for drawing, a pile of stones to essentially create these kind of, ridges on the surface of a rock, something like this. And then what I will do is essentially go back and add, one more layer to essentially create this kind of tonal difference on the surface of the different ridges of this rock. So essentially, we this again, when you think of a rock, you can think of it in many different ways. So you can have a rock that has a big flat plane that defines its kind of main structure, or you can have a kind of rock that has a lot of these different rounded planes. So essentially what we're doing over here is to create a kind of rock that has these rounded planes, right? And what we did was to use the same technique of creating a pile of stone that we learned earlier to essentially define these kind of ridges or these different rounded planes on our rock. And so essentially what happens is that when you create these smaller ridges together, they start to give an appearance of a kind of a rock with the ridges. So that's what I'm doing over here. And again, leaving a bit of, distance over here and not fully completing it makes these different ridges as part of one rock. So that's the main difference, is that essentially, in this composition, what we did was to, have a very clear definition of each outline of each rock. Each stone. So when you have a very clear outline like this and you darken these areas, then this creates a impression of a distinct stone, and this gives a feeling of different stones piled on top of one another. So that's the kind of impression we wanted. But over here what we have done is essentially keep this this other layer of lines open. And what we are also doing is to kind of taper it, and we are not darkening it all the way to the end over here. So I'm just darkening it over here, and then I'm leaving a little bit of light over here. So I'm not going all the way to the edge. So that's the other thing. Key thing is that over here again I'm darkening it till here, but I'm not going all the way to the edge. So that essentially gives an impression of openness, and that makes these different ridges as part of one unit, one rock. So again, over here I will not go all the way. So essentially I want to darken it over here, where there's kind of deep crevice over here, but I'm not taking it all the way to the edges. So that's that's how you can make these different ridges as part of one rock, instead of giving a feel for these different stones on top of one another. So there we have it. And I will go ahead and again add some more here again over here. So what I will do is again just stop and leave some white at the edges. So there we have it, right? So this is how you can, so essentially this is how you can essentially define a kind of a rock. This has this kind of ridge structure. And the other important thing is to also not add these surface crevices inside of the rock. So essentially again, coming back over here, what we did was to essentially create the surface crevices and things like that. So what we do for a rock is to essentially just define the surface crevices over here at these edges, something like this over here. So I'll only define it at this surface over here, but I will not really do it inside, because that will give an impression of those as different units of stone. So I keep that only for this outside perimeter of the rock, and I add these crevices over here, but inside I do not really so for over here I do not really kind of add the surface crevice. But what I can do is to add still add the crevices to the body of these different layers. So I'll go ahead and add again so with a bit of crevice over here, just like we did for stones over here, a bit over here, and something like this, and a bit over here, something like this. So this is how essentially you can create a kind of a rock that has these kind of different layers of structure to it. So again, the concept is very similar to the way we drew the stones in a pile of stones. You essentially draw one layer of the stone on the ground, and then you draw the other layer, but again keep it a bit open. So again define something like this, so you're not closing it fully over here. You can bring it close, but don't close it fully. And then again something like this is something like this, something like this. So this is how you can essentially create these different layers, and again shade them like we did for the stones. But again do not close the shading. So essentially do not take this darkness all the way to the edge, because that creates a feeling of closeness, and that makes this a different unit of stone. But leave this a bit light at the edges. So what happens is that you have a feeling of different layers, but again there's a feeling of openness over here, so they make them part of one unit of rock. So this is how we essentially create a give it a feeling of rock with different layers, as against this drawing where all these are coming across as different stones that are piled on top of one another. So this is how you can easily create a kind of a nice rock with different layers as part of your composition. And what I will do in the end quickly, so just again draw a kind of backdrop over here, and essentially just draw like a one tree over here. So again these kind of rocks are very fun to draw, and they can be a central element of a composition like we have over here. Or again you can make them as part of many kind of different other kind of landscapes. So essentially my aim is to show you how different elements can be easily drawn. And yeah, once you learn to draw these elements, then you can draw your your own compositions where you can use them in appropriate manner. So essentially we learned how to draw this kind of a rock with this kind of ridges, and if you want you can add one more stone over here. You can have a stone wall there and other trees and things like that. So essentially yeah, in these demonstrations that I have on my channel, I'm showing how different elements can be simply drawn with quick stroke here. But the main thing is to learn up the technique that you use behind it, and the technique that we use for this kind of stone structure, this kind of rock structure, is to essentially draw this kind of same technique that we use to draw the layers of stone, but the way we shade it is a bit different. So we do not take it all the way to the end, and that makes these different layers part of the same unit of rock, compared to other cases where we drew stones that were piled on top of one another. And what I will do is quickly again just draw this kind of tree over here using these parallel lines, and essentially create a very quick landscape around it, right? So there we have say a second tree, and what we can do then is to simply draw some kind of background tree. So this is something that we did for other demonstration, but yeah, you can use this stone in many other compositions, and this is again very fun to do. So you can have a different multiple stones of different sizes, or you can have one big stone in the center of composition like we have over here. So these kind of stones are very fun to draw, and again you can easily change the shape. You can make them high, or you can make them a bit more flatter. So again just by using different shapes you can have a lot of different stones and have real a distinctness to your drawing. So again different elements, when you add them together in a drawing, they always bring out more character to them. And having a stone like this is a real simple element that you can add to any of your drawing. And what I will do finally is to again add a bit of grass over here. So let's actually draw a bit of ground cover, right? So what we do is again use these lines to define a bit of ground form, and then I will add a bit of grass cover to these ground lines. So essentially what happens is that these ground lines, and they give a nice definition to our ground and helps us to kind of define a kind of even path that is leading. And then I'll simply go ahead and then add a bit of grass. So again, adding grass using this stroke is something that we have covered in detail, but essentially what we do is to simply use these strokes, right? And then we simply add a bit of grass here, add a bit of grass there, and this is how essentially you can quickly create a ground covered with grass. And like I said before, always like to add the small things because that gives a nice finished appearance to our drawing. So this is how easily you can create a kind of a rock that has or you can consider this as a big stone, right? So you can always look at this as a kind of a big stone that has different layers, or you can consider this as a bit of kind of a rock that has this kind of different layers. But again, the technique is very similar to drawing a pile of stones. So essentially, again, you start by drawing the stone in the front or the layer in the front, and then you draw successive layers. And again, try to keep them more interesting, different orientation, different sizes and things like that. And then you again texture them the way that we did for the stones, except don't take the dark black all the way to the edges. So you want to leave it in a bit open. And what happens is because of that, you get a feeling of these ridges, merging into each other and giving a feel for a kind of a big stone or a rock as against a pile of stones that we saw in the last demonstration. So again, over here, what I did was essentially create a very sharp black distinction between the different layers like this, right? And that gives a bit. And then I also added this kind of surface crevices to each layer, so that gives it a nice feel for a layer of stone. But what we want over here is a kind of different feel to create a kind of these different ridges that belong to the same rock. So we use the we do the shading a bit differently. And there we have it. And what we can also do is to again add a bit more grass near the base of this rock or a big stone, just to give it a bit more weight. So again, in the last demonstration I explained that whenever you have a heavy or an element that has an element of weight around it, like a stone or a in this case a kind of big stone or a rock, it's always good to darken its base a bit. That adds a bit of weight to that element. So that's what we will do. And then it also indicates a kind of shadow that that you might expect from a big element like this, this big stone or a rock. So there we have it. So I quickly added a bit more grass to create a nice layer of darkness around it. So as you can see, just adding a bit more grass and making this a bit darker again adds more interest. So that's what I keep saying, is that these small things add interest to your drawing. So always try to use them in your drawing to just to add kind of visual interest here and there. And what I'll finally do is to simply add a bit of dots over here just to kind of create a ground cover and also ground these trunks again. So I'll just add a bit of darkness to the base of these trunks just to ground them. So again, and then just add a bit of dot. And again, whenever you have a kind of ground, it's always good to have some kind of ground cover. So that's what I will do. Just add a bit of dot here, a bit of dot over there, just to create a kind of ground cover over here. And again, always when you have a trunk, always try to ground the trunk just by adding a bit of dark at its base. So there we have it. So just by adding a few dots here, a few dots there, then we have these trunks grounded. And then I'll go ahead and add a bit more dots just to create a kind of ground cover for this distant ground. So there we have it. So this is how easily you can draw a kind of rock, or you can consider this as kind of a big stone as part of your composition. And yeah, like I said, it's real fun doing it. It's real simple, and it can be used in many different ways. And yeah, the technique is very simple of drawing the successive layers, like we did for drawing layers of stone. And there you have it, right? So a simple, very simple technique that can be used to draw a nice simple rock or a or a big stone that you can use in your drawing and have real fun doing it. Thanks. Take care. Bye bye.